and quite an interesting topic tonight. Originally, when I was given the title, it was The Life of Christians in Early Rome. Now, when you look at the next slide, you'll realise that that wasn't that easy, because Rome started in BC 753, so if we were going to be looking at Christians way back then, they didn't exist. So what I did was I just rejigged the title a bit and made it The Life of Early Christians in Rome. That means we can legitimately talk about people that existed from AD 0 onwards. And when we look at the name Rome, I'm taking the liberty to use it in the broad sense. That is, we're not going to be looking just at Rome as the city, but Rome in the broader sense, that is the Roman Empire. So here's a map of Rome at AD 100, roughly, and shows you the great expanse of the Empire of Rome, and even right through to Great Britain, and right to the east to modern-day Iraq, even into bits of Iran. What is interesting to note is the triumph of Christianity. We start off with the birth of Jesus in BC 4, and by 395 AD, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So it's an amazing growth from nothing. 400 years later, it's the official religion of the whole Roman Empire. Now, this slide, I think, is quite interesting and compelling for us. I've put that quotation up the top from Galatians because, as we know, God rules in the kingdoms of men, and nothing happens on earth without it being part of the plan and purpose of God. So in Galatians 4 verse 4, we have the record that Jesus was born at the appropriate time that God decreed that he should be born. In other words, the birth of Jesus, of Mary, wasn't something that just happened to come along at a time that suited Joseph and Mary. It was exactly as God decreed it to be. So when the fullness of time was come, so in God's plan, Jesus was born at the right time. And by the same token, Christianity spread throughout the empire according to the purpose of God. God decreed that this was the time for Christianity to spread. And as we know in the book of Acts, the Christians, or the believers, were first called Christians in the ecclesia at Antioch in Acts chapter 11. Now we have a map of the spread of Christianity over a period of time. So you've got there originally the spread in 185 AD, I think it is, in the purple, and then about 140 years later, you can see how much Christianity has spread throughout the empire. That's all the territory in green. So it's quite a massive expansion of the Christian population in the empire. Now, how did the population of the Christians relate to the total population of the empires? Well, here's a thought from experts that tell us what the growth of Christianity was like. As it says there's no precise figures, but the best estimates are fewer than 10,000 by 100 AD, and then double that in the next century. Sorry, what would you call that? 20 times. 20 times that by the end of the next century. And then, by the time of getting close to Constantine, estimated 6 million out of a total population of 60 million. So 10% of the population by the time of Constantine were Christians. That's amazing, isn't it? An incredible growth of Christianity. Now, how did this come about? Well, here's a picture of a Roman road under construction. And the Roman roads were not roads just put together haphazardly, she'll be right, and just throw a few rocks onto the ground and pummel them into the dirt and make it reasonably smooth. They went about making the Roman roads very scientifically, and it was an engineering feat, even to the extent of having drainage ditches on the side. And, when the Romans built those roads, they didn't build them necessarily to last for 2,000 years. but they did, because you can go to places in Europe today and you'll find those Roman roads still there. Now, admittedly, they're no longer used for heavy traffic, but nevertheless, to think that 2,000 years after the roads were constructed, they're still there today. And gradually, over a period of time, Rome developed a network of well-established Roman roads traversing about 50,000 miles in the empire. Here's a map of the Roman roads about 100 AD. All those little red markings there are the extent of these well-constructed Roman roads. And you can see that they traverse from east in Asia, right across the traditional Roman territory, right up into Great Britain. Now, I'd like to quote you some words here from Edward Gibbon. And I found this quite amazing because, you know, when we think of the days of Jesus and the days of the apostles, we may sometimes think that it was 2,000 years ago, and therefore we can expect society to be fairly, backward in a sense compared to our society. And the lifestyle of people back then was vastly different to the lifestyle today. Well, it may come as a bit of a shock to us that actually the lifestyle of the citizens of the empire 2,000 years ago in many ways could fit right into the lifestyle of today. Now, here are some comments by Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. When Edward Gibbon was writing about the fall of the Roman Empire in the late 18th century, now that doesn't mean the empire fell in the late 18th century, that means when he wrote these words, he could argue that transportation hadn't changed since ancient times. An imperial messenger on the Roman roads could get from Rome to London even faster in AD 100 than 1650 years later. Now, isn't that interesting? That's how well Rome had established its network of roads, etc. A messenger could go from point A to point B faster in AD 100 compared to 1750. Of course, 100 years later, and more obviously today, all of that has changed. And today, of course, we have supersonic aircraft and, people who own Holdens can get up to, 50 k's an hour. Fords double that. But, we can go a lot faster today, and we benefit from modern technology. Here's some other comments about the Roman Empire. Augustus Caesar, who was the first emperor of the Roman Empire, he established the Roman Empire by instituting a civil service, rule by law, common coinage, that is the denarius, and secure travel and trade throughout the empire. So the roads were policed, you might say. They kept on top of terrorism and attacks by brigands and robbers lurking in the bushes along the roads. Generally speaking, it was considered to be quite safe to travel along a Roman road. And we know that second point there, rule by law. How many times when you look at the New Testament do you come across incidents where particularly the Apostle Paul actually exercised his rights under Roman law as to how he was to be judged or treated as a prisoner? On more than one occasion, the Apostle Paul spoke to the Roman authorities and made it very clear that it was not legal for them to do what they, on one occasion, did do to Paul, and on another occasion were thinking of doing to Paul. The mere fact that he could say, I am a Roman citizen, didn't matter that he came from Tarsus, didn't matter wherever in the empire he was, if he could say, I am a Roman citizen, then immediately the authorities thought twice about taking some drastic action against that prisoner. They would not torture that prisoner because they knew under Roman law they could be held accountable. Now, has anyone heard of the phrase Pax Romana? It's not a new form of pasta. Pax Romana. It's actually meaning Roman peace. Now, this is another significant development in the Roman Empire. So, On the left-hand side, you have Pax Romana, and it means Roman peace. The Roman Empire enjoyed about 200 years of peace and prosperity, known as Pax Romana, under imperial rule, beginning with Augustus and ending with Marcus Aurelius. And the Roman Empire stretched across a territory equivalent to the area of the United States of America. So what was the economic impact of this Pax Romana? Well, you had a uniform system of money, as I mentioned, which helped to expand trade throughout the empire. You had safe travel and trade. It was guaranteed on the Roman roads, which were built and protected by Roman legions. And it'd be good, actually, if we had have had those Roman road builders today, because by now that South Road Darlington setup would have been finished a year ago. And during this time, the empire was prosperous and stable. So what, you might say? Well, so what, yes. This helped the spread of Christianity, you see. When people became converted, it wasn't as though they then had to sort of launch out into the savage jungle and hack their way through trees and, you know, lions and tigers and elephants jumping out of them. They went across the empire on Roman roads, and they went into established cities, and they met people at the local McDonald's, so to speak, and sat down and had a chat. All this was taking place in the Roman Empire, and it helped with the massive spread of Christianity. Now here's a shot. I think this is a little glamorous, but here's a shot of what is considered to be, you can't read that writing, neither can I on this thing here, but these townhouses were allegedly quite frequently found in the Roman Empire as the dwelling places of the average Joe in the empire. Joe's quite an appropriate name for Italian. So a lot of Joes would live in these type of houses. Now look at them. They didn't have electricity, of course, but they would have had running water. They probably would be able to have a hot bath every Friday night or once a month if you came from England. You know, all these sort of things were being held in the empire all the time. It wasn't a backward place. The empire was known for its modern facilities and prosperity. Here's a layout of a Roman city. Now, see that road going sort of like north-south, like our South Road. All the cities, essentially built by the Romans, were constructed on a similar layout. They had very good town planners. The main street was called the Cardo Maximus, a north-south road, and that was traversed by another road called the Decumanus Maximus. Now, all the shopping, all the Rundle Mall type shops were along the Cardo Maximus. And where the Decumanus Maximus crossed the Cardo, that was where the Forum was. That's where, you might say, the centre of the city was. And everyone came to that place. And you can just imagine, for example, the Apostle Paul coming into a city and going to that crossroads where the Forum was and sitting down there perhaps on a stone seat discussing the scriptures with people and inviting them to come to wherever he was dwelling to have further discussions. Talking about the Forum, here's a slide I picked up of daily life in ancient Rome, and that's the Forum. And as you can see, there's soldiers there, there's people, you know, doing a bit of acting, either singing or doing a bit of acrobats, you know, what you see in the buskers in Rundle Mall today. People discussing everyday life, business, mothers perhaps taking their children into town to do a bit of shopping. All of this took place in the cities of ancient Rome. Now here's a depiction of what it was like in the Cardo Maximus. I'm pretty certain that this picture here, if I can remember rightly, is a reproduction of a painting that you'll find in Jerusalem, because when we were in Jerusalem in February last year, we went, I'll just show you this first. You can go down, you might say, underneath the city of Jerusalem, and there you find the excavations of the original cardo in the city of Jerusalem. See those pillars there? Well, they're like the pillars there, where you had this long straight road, and on either side you had the shops, and people would walk down those streets, and they would meet all sorts of people and look into all sorts of shops selling hardware or clothing or food. Everything was there in the cardo. It was just a remarkable place. This was Rome. That is, this was the Roman Empire in the big cities in the 1st century AD. And we actually saw those ruins there in Jerusalem. It's fascinating to go there and see the ruins of the ancient cardo in the city of Jerusalem. So I'm giving you, first of all, just a background as to what it was like in the empire. Now here's a shot of a fast food outlet. Just as in modern Rome, many people snacked and ate their midday meal standing at a counter. So you've got the guys there behind the counter ordering their meal. You've got the owner of the restaurant dressed there in his blue outfit. Of course, you must have a dog there to chew the scraps. But it was no different to today. You know, you walk into McDonald's and there you order something from the counter, and you just sit down at a chair or just stand eating. This was happening in Rome 2,000 years ago. Not much different to today. All right, so that's a bit of a background to what was happening in the empire. Now, let's have a bit more of a talk about Christianity. Right, so how did Christianity spread? Well, Edward Gibbon, once again, in his book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he didn't like Christianity, and not surprising, because his attitude of Christianity was built upon what he knew from the established church, the Roman Catholic Church, etc. But anyway, he scorned Christianity, but he revealed the strengths and the secrets of the spread in his critique. What were the secrets for the spread of Christianity? They had zeal. They believed in promise of a future life. There were miracles. Certainly there were miracles in the 1st century AD, because the elder brethren in the ecclesias had the gifts of the Spirit. And those gifts of the Spirit lasted right until the very last person that had the gift died. So, for example, if you were given the gift of healing, say by the Apostle John, in AD 90, and you were only 25 years old, and let's say you lived to the average age then of about 60, that meant there were healings still taking place into the 2nd century, say 125, 130 AD. So miracles were still being performed 100 years after Jesus had ascended to heaven. What were the other appealing features? Austere morals. There was the creation of a state or a community within the empire itself, and it not only created a community, but it was a personal community. It wasn't as though you were just a citizen of the state and you didn't know your neighbour very well. In the Christian community, it was very close, as we know. People knew each other. They looked after each other. They were some of the appealing features of becoming a convert to Christianity. When you look at the Roman Empire, yes, it was a magnificent empire. It was big, it was strong, it was prosperous. It had 200 years of peace, virtually, up until 200 AD. But by the same token, in the empire, there was all the corruption of a modern society we have it today. Politicians were corrupt. People's morality was corrupt. There was all sorts of evil practices carried out throughout the empire. And if you were a person like today who was worried about what was happening in society, then Christianity had the answers. And brothers and sisters and friends, this is one of the wonderful things about the truth, you know, because, you know, we live in a fairly corrupt society today, and we may think whoever is going to come along to our lectures, okay, not many, but does it matter if it's not many? So long as there are one or two, there's always going to be someone interested in the Bible. It reminded me of an incident that happened only a week or so ago. We got a couple at our meeting, Greg and Miriam Pullman, and they were at a restaurant called Fresh Choice. I don't know if you've ever been to Fresh Choice. I went there once and the stuff wasn't fresh, so I've never been back. But anyway, it's retained its name, Fresh Choice. And anyway, Greg and Mim went there because it's cheap. And they're having their meal. And a lady, at the end of the meal, a lady came up to them and said, "Look, I'd just like to ask you, I was really impressed with how well behaved your children were." And they've got young children. Rebecca, the oldest one, is about 10. And they were so well behaved, and the woman was just blown away by this, because normally she was expecting kids to be rampaging throughout Fresh Choice. The extent of her inquiry led to this woman now coming to our Sunday evening addresses and Bible classes. Now, there you are. This woman, it's almost like in the days of Jesus. There were people there looking for something. This woman may not have necessarily been looking for Christianity. She may have been a Christian already, for all I know. But anyway, she was attracted by the lifestyle of Greg and Mim. So there you are, Ruth, up the back there with your... how many have you got? 5 or 6 children. But anyway, you know, it's a lot of children. Right, now let's move on. Talking about preaching the truth. You know the incident in Acts chapter 19? A 2-year Bible study. Paul took the disciples with him and had discussions daily in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. This went on for 2 years. This was in the city of Ephesus. And on the right-hand side are sorry, it's not on the right-hand side, but here they are. This is the alleged ruins of the house of Tyrannus. Now, it's a pretty majestic house, isn't it? Probably 2 reasons for that. He was a school teacher, and therefore he could afford a house like that. And his name was appropriate. Tyrannus means a tyrant, and he obviously ruled people with a rod of iron, and he was able to, you know, get on in life and make a bit of money. Anyway, not just in the Forum, but also elsewhere in the empire, things were happening. What about at the end of Acts chapter 2? Perhaps you just might like to turn this quote up, because this gives us an insight as to how the truth was spreading. This is right at the end of the conversion of 3,000 people to the truth. And we read in Acts chapter 2, verses 46 and 47. Now, my eyesight's not too good, because when I was looking in the back hall there, I thought it was my great niece, Ruth. But it's not. It looks like Vanessa. So Vanessa, you haven't got 6 children, have you? Okay. Although you've got a fairly big house. Right. So you could actually have some more. Right. Acts chapter 2, verses 46 and 47. And they, continuing daily with one accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart, praising God and having favour with all the people. And the Lord added to the ecclesia daily such as should be saved. When you think about it, brothers and sisters and friends, where else were they going to meet other than house to house? Yes, they could go to the synagogues, because at this stage all those that were coming into the truth were Jews. There was no Gentiles at all. So they could go to the synagogues, and they no doubt did on the Sabbath, to discuss with people the things of the Bible. But when it came to having a memorial meeting, the synagogues would not be the place. But they couldn't go to the local RSL hall, could they? Or the Druids, or the Ancient Order of Oddfellows Hall or something, and, you know, pay their £20 and hire the hall for the weekend. Those halls didn't exist. Or if they did, they wouldn't be available to this new-fangled group called the Christians, even though they weren't called Christians at that stage. So how are they going to have their meetings? House to house. And I venture to say that quite a few years afterwards, that's where all the meetings would have been held. You wouldn't be able to hire a hall. you wouldn't be able to practice that religion quite openly. Rome was very tolerant to religious groups, so long as they didn't cause any trouble. Generally speaking, in the early years of the empire, Rome left people alone. But by the same token, it wouldn't have been that wise for Christians to be too open in their meetings, because they received a lot of trouble from those who opposed them. But anyway, some time ago, they found some ruins of a house church, and this is in Syria somewhere, and it's the oldest Christian, or the ruins of the oldest Christian house church that was constructed between 233 and 256 AD. Now, we don't have to go into all the details as to what all the various rooms were used for, but the archaeologists dug up the ruins of this, and they could establish quite clearly, apparently, that this was a house specifically used, amongst other things, besides living in it, for religious services. So I thought it was quite interesting. We read those words in Acts, they moved around from house to house. And then we have the actual words in the scriptures anyway. Paul writes to our beloved Apphia and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church or ecclesia in your house. And that was written by Paul to Philemon. So even many years later in the empire, they are still meeting in a house. Now I want to just deal with the problems that would have been faced with the early Christians. Okay, the truth, Christianity is spreading like wildfire. It's going throughout the empire. They're not coming under much opposition in the early days. They would have come under opposition from the Jews, that's true. Paul makes reference to that in Thessalonians. He had the same problem in Rome, and no doubt there would have been other cities. He copped it in Ephesus, in Corinth. But as far as getting opposition from the Roman citizens was concerned, there wasn't too much. And certainly the government wasn't too concerned about this new Christian group. But the problem they did have, the early Christians, what they did have was false teaching. You know this quote from Galatians. But even if we, or an angel from heaven, preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed. Now, the letter to the Galatians, brothers and sisters and friends, was one of the early letters of Paul. It wasn't one of his late letters. It would have been one of the very early letters that he wrote. So even in the early times of the spread of Christianity, false teaching was creeping in. Now that would have been difficult, wouldn't it? You start off with the pristine gospel preached by Christ and by the 12 apostles, and yet within a very short period of time, false doctrine is being preached. So much so that we know how that they gathered together in Jerusalem to have a conference, recorded in Acts chapter 15, to discuss the Judaistic teaching that Paul wrote about in Galatians, how that it was necessary for Gentiles to be circumcised and to keep the law of Moses to be saved. And Paul, of course, and Barnabas and others strenuously resisted that teaching. They resisted it with everything they had, but nevertheless, these brethren, these Judaisers, pushed their cause. So the conference was held in Jerusalem to thrash out the matter. Then, right at the end of Paul's last missionary journey, he gathered the elders of Ephesus together and he gave them a last message. And he said to them, "For I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock. Also of your own selves shall men arise, speaking perverse things, to draw away disciples after them. Therefore watch and remember that by the space of 3 years I ceased not to warn everyone night and day with tears." So there's 3 quotations to show that problems were developing amongst the early Christians. Then we had the prediction by Paul in 2 Timothy 4, when he said, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears." So Paul could tell that over a period of time, what would develop amongst the Christian communities was that the listeners would go to the teachers and say, "Look, we're sick of this straight down the line teaching. We're sick of you sort of saying, this is what you have to believe and do. We want you to be more mellow in your presentation. We want a little bit of spark where we can have a laugh or two and enjoy the Bible." So that's what Paul said. They would gather to themselves teachers. So they would decide what sort of teachers they had. And the teachers they wanted were those that would teach them what they wanted to hear, like this cartoon here. On the left, faithful Bible teaching here. There's just mum and the child. And on the right, ear tickling here. And you have to buy tickets to get in. That's how apostasy developed. And I like this little one. The seller of the Bibles are us. Can I get a customised Bible geared specifically for the way I want to live? And that's what Paul's saying to us in 2 Timothy chapter 4. So that was the difficulties. Now we're going to move on to the problem of persecutions. Now, in case you may or may not know this, really there was no wholesale persecution of the early Christians until the time of Nero, and that was in AD 64. So when you look at the beginning of Christianity, say in AD 33 roundabout, Christianity effectively was able to spread rapidly over a 30-year period without any great hindrance from the government. Now that's not a bad time, and God in his wisdom saw to it that Christianity was able to spread. But eventually troubles developed. The first recorded official persecution of Christians on behalf of the Roman Empire was in AD 64, when, as reported by the Roman historian Tacitus, Emperor Nero attempted to blame Christians for the Great Fire of Rome. Now, why was Nero against the Christians? Well, we don't know precisely. I don't think he was necessarily against them for any specific thing they preached. It was just that Nero could see that they would be a good scapegoat to blame for the fire in Rome. But there were plenty of other reasons why people didn't like Christians. That is, they separated themselves from immorality and idolatry, and that was rampant in the empire. This particularly angered those who prospered from idolatry. They refused to worship Roman gods. They had no idols or temples. And so people said, you must be atheist because you've got no idols or temples in your mode of worship. So you don't even believe in a god, let alone our gods. They claimed to have absolute religion in a pluralistic society. In other words, the Christians would say, our teaching is the only one that is correct. And it was true. It was the only one that was correct. And this would have been an affront to the Romans, who never heard such a teaching like this before. Because, as I mentioned before, Rome was tolerant of all sorts of religions, but the Christians weren't. They were somewhat secretive. Well, they had to be, because they didn't want to breed too much suspicion. They were accused of many ludicrous fabrications. They were blamed for earthquakes, floods, etc. Tertullian said, "We have a reputation for living aloof from crowds." So the government saw them as somewhat dangerous. They refused to worship Caesar, so their loyalty was questioned. They were a threat to state religion, and thus the unity of the empire. And finally, they were a unified group that proclaimed their own king, that is Christ. And lastly, and most importantly, they proselytised. They were active in speaking to others about their beliefs. So, in the letter that Peter wrote to the believers, let's just turn now with me to 1 Peter chapter 4 and just see what Peter had to say about what he knew through the Spirit would come upon the believers. So 1 Peter chapter 4, and we're going to read from verse 12 and 13. Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you, But rejoice, inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy. Now it is believed that Peter actually was eventually killed by Emperor Nero. So if that was the case, then these words written by Peter were written before Nero's persecution started. But Peter, writing under the power of the Spirit, was warning that a fiery trial was coming upon them. Now that's not referring to the fire of Rome, it's referring to the terrible persecution that Nero would unleash against the Christians. So anyway, there was this great fire of Rome in AD 64. And Nero was widely criticised after that great fire. And so in his attempt to divert attention away from his own failings, the Christians were an easy scapegoat. And Nero wasted no time. He arrested and tortured the Christians in Rome before executing them with lavish publicity. Some were crucified, some were thrown to wild animals, and others were burned alive as living torches. And when you look at the history of those times, it's clear that the Christians did go through an incredible fiery trial. Sometimes I've heard it said by brothers giving talks, if we had been living in those days, we would have caved in. But brothers and sisters, I don't agree with that comment. Not because I think that we are strong, but I'll say this. We are, in a way, the products of our environment. What I mean by that is this. If we had been living in AD 64, that is all of us here tonight, we would have been used to the style of life in the empire. We would have seen crucifixions along the road. We would have seen criminals and all sorts of people being torn apart by wild animals and dogs. We would have seen people being burnt to death. And we would have known that that could be our lot. And I think that in every age, whilst we think that we would not be able to withstand that trial, I believe that if we were back in those days, we would have been able to, if we were faithful to the truth. And I think it's wrong for some to say that we would have caved in, because it's almost saying that our faith's not strong enough to withstand trial. We have our own trials today, and they're bad, they're very bad. In some respects, whilst they're not hurting us physically, they are hurting us and destroying us spiritually. And the trials that we have to face today are just as gruesome and onerous as far as the long-term effects are concerned as to what our brothers and sisters underwent in the trials under Nero. Well, after Nero, there was the emperor by the name of Domitian, and he was a bad emperor. He ruled about 20 years after Nero. He persecuted the Christians, and it is believed that he was the one that exiled John the Apostle to the Isle of Patmos. And so we have John now on the Isle of Patmos. I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom, the tribulation he's referring to is his exile to the island by Domitian, and the patient endurance that are in Jesus was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. Now what is interesting from that is John wasn't put to death, was he? Okay, he was a Christian. The emperor didn't like John, but he didn't kill him. And through the grace of God, John was banished to the Isle of Patmos. And there on that island, he received that remarkable revelation that he put to paper, pen to paper. And so we have it as the last book in the Bible. And in Revelation 6, we have the description of events that would take place in the Roman Empire under 4 horses, a white, a red, black, and a ghastly green one. Now, when we look at the record in Revelation 6, what do we find is meant by that white horse? Well, here's a suggestion. And I saw and behold a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering to conquer. And it is generally believed that what is being depicted here by that white horse is not a normal warrior going forth and slashing people left and right by the sword. It's rather depicting the progress of a peaceful way of life. That's why it's a white horse. And what is being presented here in Romans 6 is actually depicting the spread of Christianity in the 2nd century AD, and that is what happened. You remember I mentioned before that for the first 200 years of the empire, things were fairly peaceful and stable. Well, they were. Now, admittedly, there were two persecutions, major persecutions against the Christians by Nero and Domitian. But by and large, the Christians had a pretty good run. And I'd like to show you some comments written by, once again, Edward Gibbon, as to how he saw the first 200 years. In the 2nd century of the Christian era, the Empire of Rome comprehended the fairest part of the earth and the most civilised portion of mankind. The frontiers of that extensive monarchy were guarded by ancient renown and disciplined valour. The gentle but powerful influence of laws and manners had gradually cemented the union of the provinces. Their peaceful inhabitants enjoyed and abused the advantages of wealth and luxury. Yes, the general citizens may have abused what they were given, but the Christians used the opportunity to spread the gospel, and that's what happened. And that is why in Revelation 6, when we have this white horse going forth to conquer, it's really depicting the spread of Christianity in a peaceful way, and that's really what took place. And it wasn't until the end of the 2nd century that persecution then began to really develop against the Christians. It became more wholesale, and the Christians started to suffer. But you know, brothers and sisters and friends, through the grace of God, in that 100-year period after Domitian, the Christian truth, the word of God, went forth like a fire, and it captured the hearts and minds of many people. But sadly, persecution eventually came. But here's another comment. Roman persecution strengthened Christianity by forcing it to become more organised. The emerging control over Christianity communities by bishops was important to this change. The Christian church was creating a distinction between the clergy, church leaders and the laity, everyday church members. Now we're getting into a sad part of the spread of Christianity in our talk tonight generally about the early Christians. Because as time went on and as the truth spread, so more corruption crept in. Not just with regard to doctrine, but now with regard to the administration of the believers. Whereas previously the bishops and the other elders in the ecclesias did not lord it over the flock. In other words, they considered themselves to be on the same level as the flock, as the Bible taught. Now these bishops and elders began to take a superior position. And so gradually you can see this concept of church bishops and archbishops and eventually cardinals and then the Pope. All this hierarchy of the church began to develop as time went on. And in the persecutions that took place, it wasn't just only against the established corrupt Christianity, our brothers and sisters suffered as well. So the great persecutions of Christians began in the 3rd century, that is after this 200 peaceful years spoken of by Gibbon. It started by the Emperor Decius around 250 and continued until the death of Galerius in 311. And the usual reasons for the persecution was because of what factors we've looked at before. Round about the year 200 AD, it's considered that many persecuted groups started digging under Rome and developing tunnels and meeting places and grave sites. And you can go to Rome today and go into these catacombs and find amazing tunnels right underneath the city, a bit like those tunnels developed by the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War, where they developed tunnels underground to fight the United States. They could shift their armies without the United States even knowing how they were being shifted. So there was another lifestyle happening under the city of Rome. Now, I'm not saying that this was something developed by the true believers. It would have been just by the Christians generally, but no doubt the true believers as well would have had to been forced to go underground to preserve their life. And so we come to the last great persecution by the Emperor Diocletian. He was the emperor of the 3rd century, and he was extremely hostile to Christianity. His persecution of Christians was the most severe of the Roman Empire, and he demanded that everyone worship the Roman gods, Saturn, Mercury, etc. Now, in the Roman religion, Terminus was the god who protected boundary markers. So that's why, you catch the bus or the tram, you go to the terminus. That's the end stop, and it comes from this Roman god called Terminus. His name was the Latin word for such a marker. Sacrifices were performed to sanctify each boundary stone, and landowners celebrated a festival called the Terminalia in Terminus's honour each year. So Terminalia was an ancient Roman festival. Now, why am I telling you this? The main reason is because I've been talking now for 50 minutes and some of you are starting to drift off. So I thought if I brought this in at this stage, you would think, what has this got to do with Christianity? And this tactic works because people then suddenly wake up and they think, what's it got to do with it? What's he talking about? So, okay, I've now got your attention. So why am I raising this? Right, okay, I'll tell you why. When Diocletian instigated the last great persecution from 303 to 311, he went on a rampage and he just slaughtered Christians left, right and centre. But what I want you to notice is this comment. Diocletian, should not be apostrophe there or S. Diocletian initiated his persecution of Christians on the 23rd of February 303. Now that's not my, 23rd of February is not my birthday, so I'm not putting it up there for that. Presumably as an attempt at enlisting the god Terminus to put a limit to the progress of Christianity. Now remember that? Terminus was the god who protected boundary markers. In other words, when people ploughed a field, they would put this god, an idol or an image to the god Terminus at the end of their field and say, this is the limit, this is my territory, you can't come here. So when Diocletian initiated this persecution, he commenced it on the 23rd of February 303 because that was the festival celebrating the god Terminus. In other words, the god Terminus in Diocletian's mind represented his attitude. He was saying to the people of Rome and elsewhere throughout the empire, we've got to make a stand. These Christians cannot go any further, and our god Terminus is going to stop them. He's the god of the boundary, and this is the limit to which the Christians are allowed to go. Well, so he thought, because over in the UK, there's a statue in the city of York to Constantine. He was one of the 4 great rulers of the empire. And in AD 312, Constantine left the UK and marched towards Rome, and his objective was eventually to become the great ruler of the Roman Empire. And on his way to Italy to confront another one of the emperors, and knowing that he was to fight the most important battle of his life, he prayed fervently for some form of divine revelation. And it is reported that he saw a vision in the sky of a cross. So he looked up the sky and he saw a cross there above the sun. And on this cross there was an inscription in Latin which said, "Conquer by this." Now you can say what you like about this, brothers and sisters, but the fact is that Constantine adopted the sign of the cross as his emblem on the flags and on his shields. And he went into Rome effectively using Christianity, so-called, as the basis of him being victorious. So he got to Rome and he came to this bridge called the Milvian Bridge, and when we were in Rome last year we saw this. It was just fantastic to stand on that bridge that Constantine stood on in AD 312. There was a battle there. He won the battle and started on the path that led him to end the Tetrarchy and become the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. And the Arch of Constantine, which we also saw in Rome, erected in celebration of the victory, attributes Constantine's success to divine intervention. And there's the Arch of Constantine. It's very much like the Arch of Titus, isn't it, which is also in Rome. And this great arch, which you can see in the city of Rome, next to the Colosseum, it commemorates that fantastic battle on the Milvian Bridge above the Tiber on the 28th of October 303. He won the battle, and next thing we know, after a few short years, Constantine became the first Christian emperor of the empire. And I've given you the quotation there from Revelation 6:12, which talks about this great earthquake that would take place. And it was. I mean, you fancy this. Up until Constantine, the religion of the empire was paganism, atheism. Constantine comes along, totally transforms the empire, and it becomes a Christian empire. If that's not an earthquake, well, we don't know what an earthquake is. And here are some medals coined by Constantine and his son. And on those medals, it shows a cross, which is what Constantine saw in the sky. It shows a cross erected over the fallen dragon. Now, did Constantine pick up Revelation chapter 12 or Revelation 6 and read that? No, he didn't. But isn't it remarkable that in the coins that they minted, he is actually expressing the words of Scripture found in Revelation 12, verse 9. So, Matt, we've just about finished, in case you were wondering. Because you're probably wondering how those pasties are going. Now, okay, what happened a year later, in the year 313, there was known as the Edict of Milan. And there was a letter signed by the Emperors Constantine and Licinius that proclaimed religious toleration in the Roman Empire. This meant that Christianity was no longer illegal. Now, just make this clear, or get this clear. He didn't Christianise the empire at this stage. He didn't say Christianity is the official religion of the empire. What he did do in 313 was to make Christianity legal. So in other words, Christians could no longer be looked upon as practising an illegal religion. So in that sense, Christians now had the protection of the state. And just one other thing, if anyone can tell me why there's the letter E in brackets after Constantine and the letter W after Licinius, then you'll solve one of the big mysteries of all mankind, because I've got no idea why that's there. Right. He legalised Christianity. He converted himself and was its greatest patron. He supported the spread of the religion and the building of great churches, and Christianity later became the official state religion. Well, when did that happen? It was in AD 380, according to my notes, although earlier tonight someone said it was 395. But anyway, in AD 380, the Emperor Theodosius, who was an ardent Christian and recognised the incredible growth of the faith, recognised Christianity as the official religion of the empire. And now the tables were turned. Now we have severe punishments for pagans and those who held the heretic view of the nature of Jesus, known as Arianism. And by the beginning of the 5th century, after just 400 years, the church grew from a fledgling mystery cult on the day of Pentecost into a power on nearly equal terms with the Roman emperor himself. So that's the story, brothers and sisters, of the life of early Christians in Rome. But I've got two more quotes, Matthew, just to finish off. I know I've gone a couple of minutes over time, but just two more quotations. Years ago, when Brother Percy Mansfield used to produce what was known as the Herald of the Coming Age, they were sort of like a monthly publication dealing with many doctrines. And he frequently used to print this quotation I'm going to show you in a minute, from Edward Gibbon again, about how gradually the firm belief of the original Christians in the coming of Christ and the setting up of the kingdom of God for 1,000 years, over a period of time, certainly by the time of Constantine, had been diluted so much that they no longer believed it. So whereas in 400 years, by this quotation here on the screen, Christianity had spread to enormous numbers, the sad thing is that by the same time, true Christianity had effectively disappeared apart from the faithful remnant. So here's the quotation from Edward Gibbon. The ancient and popular doctrine of the millennium was intimately connected with the second coming of Christ. As the works of the creation had been finished in 6 days, their duration in their present state, according to a tradition, was fixed to 6,000 years. By the same analogy, it was inferred that this long period of labour and contention would be succeeded by a joyful Sabbath of 1,000 years, and that Christ, with the triumphant band of the saints and the elect who had escaped death, or who had been miraculously revived, would reign upon earth till the time appointed for the last and general resurrection. Now, they are the words of Gibbon. He was an atheist. He didn't like Christians, but he's got it spot on as to what we believe, hasn't he? Now look what he says in the second half. The assurance of such a millennium was carefully inculcated by a succession of fathers from Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, who conversed with the immediate disciples of the apostles, down to Lactantius, who was preceptor to the son of Constantine. Though it might not have been universally received, it appears to have been the reigning sentiment of the Orthodox believers. Well, that's true. Orthodox believers believed in the millennium. Now we come to the sad part. But when the edifice of the church was almost completed, otherwise known as the time of Constantine, the temporary support, that is, the temporary support of a belief in a millennium, was laid aside. The doctrine of Christ's reign upon the earth was at first treated as a profound allegory, was considered by degrees as a doubtful and useless opinion, and was at length rejected as the absurd invention of heresy and fanaticism. So if you walked into a Roman church today and asked the bishop, what do you think of the teaching of Christ's 1,000 years reign upon earth? I don't know what you're talking about. The kingdom of God is now. We are the kingdom of God. The Pope is Jesus Christ on earth. Why do we want a 1,000-year reign of Christ? We've got it now. The Pope's Christ. He's reigning from the Vatican. So just one final quote, Matt, just for us to think about. Here's the Brotherhood today, and I'm not putting this up in any way in a negative sense. I'm just showing, look at the Brotherhood today. We've got a firm doctrine, the BASF. Back in the war years, we rescued Jews from persecution. We give fantastic talks on Bible prophecy. Don Pierce puts out his milestones to the kingdom. You've got a brother there preaching to people out in the backwoods of somewhere, probably 2 wells or something like that. You've even got what appears to me to be Greg Palmer nestling in a chair there. Would that be right? Is that correct? I think it is. But anyway. And then on the last screen, we've got your daily Bible readings. So that's just a sort of like a, what do you call that? It's something called menage or something, isn't it? Huh? Right. I didn't quite hear that, but whatever you said sounded right. A collage. Is that what you said? Yeah. Okay. So it's just a snapshot of what our brotherhood is like. And brothers and sisters, if we're going to learn anything from tonight, it is, let's be as fervent as the early Christians were 2,000 years ago. And let's not end up like they did, sadly, as the established church that considered the doctrine of the millennium to be bunkum. Let's maintain our faith through to the coming of our Lord. Thank you.